The cargo bay of the transport vessel hummed with the low vibration of its engines as it carried its precious cargo toward the mining station at 4:42. Among the dozens of passengers crammed into the metal benches, one figure sat apart from the rest, kept his head down, staring at his calloused hands folded in his lap. The other passengers gave him a wide berth, their alien features twisted in expressions of disgust and suspicion. He was the only human aboard the ship. The passengers whispered among themselves in their melodic language, their crystalline skin catching the harsh fluorescent lights. Occasionally, one would gesture in his direction, and didn't need to understand their words to know they were discussing the primitive in their midst. He had grown accustomed to such treatment over the past 3 years, since humanity had been reluctantly admitted into the Galactic Consortium. Humans were considered the bottom tier of galactic society. Their technology was deemed backward, their culture barbaric, and their intelligence questionable. Most species viewed them as barely evolved primates who had somehow stumbled into space travel. The only reason humans were tolerated at all was because they were willing to take on the dangerous jobs that other species considered beneath them. Shifted uncomfortably on the hard bench, his mining equipment bag clutched tightly against his chest. Inside were his personal tools, worn smooth from years of use, and a small photograph of his sister Sarah and her 2 children back on Earth. It was the only thing that kept him going through the long, lonely months in the deep space mines. A passenger, his skin a pale blue that marked him as young, leaned toward his companion. "I heard the mining company is so desperate they're hearing humans now," he said in heavily accented galactic standard, making sure could hear. "Can you imagine trusting those creatures with actual work?" His companion, an older female with darker crystalline skin, shook her head in dismay. "The galaxy is truly going to ruin when we must rely on such primitive beings. I've heard they can't even perform basic quantum calculations without mechanical assistance." Clenched his jaw but said nothing. He had learned long ago that defending himself only made things worse. Humans who spoke up were labeled as aggressive and unpredictable, confirming every negative stereotype about their species. Better to endure the insults and prove his worth through actions rather than words. The ship's intercom crackled to life, announcing their approach to the mining station. Through the small porthole beside him, could see the massive industrial complex growing larger against the backdrop of space. 442's mining station was one of the most dangerous operations in this sector, extracting rare quantum crystals from the planet's unstable core. It was exactly the kind of place where humans were sent to work. As the ship docked, the passengers began to gather their belongings, stood and shouldered his bag, waiting patiently as the other passengers filed out first. It was an unwritten rule that humans always waited until last, another small reminder of their place in the galactic hierarchy. The docking bay was a bustling hub of activity. Cargo loaders, most of them members of the species, scuttled back and forth with containers of equipment and supplies. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and recycled atmosphere. Made his way toward the passenger processing area, where a bored-looking official sat behind a desk, his elongated head barely lifting to acknowledge the new arrivals. "Purpose of visit?" the official asked in a monotone voice when approached. "Employment with Mining Consortium," replied, handing over his work authorization documents. The large black eyes scanned the paperwork with obvious disdain. "Human laborer, Section C7, report to supervisor immediately." He stamped the documents with unnecessary force and waved away dismissively. Followed the signs through the station's corridors, noting how other beings stepped aside or turned their faces away as he passed. The mining station was a maze of industrial passages, all painted the same dull gray and lit by harsh overhead lighting. The air grew thicker and more oppressive as he descended toward the lower levels where the human quarters were located. Section C7 was exactly what he had expected, a cramped dormitory area with narrow bunks stacked 3 high. The walls were bare metal, and the only ventilation came from a few struggling air recyclers that filled the room with a constant mechanical wheeze. About 20 other humans were already there, most of them lying on their bunks or sitting on the floor, talking quietly among themselves. "Fresh meat," called out a grizzled man with prematurely gray hair and arms covered in mining scars. "Names, been here 8 months. What's your story, kid?" Set his bag down on an empty lower bunk. Used to work the asteroid mines in the Sol system before they shut down. "Ah, another refugee from the Great Automation Project," said with bitter humor. "Let me guess, they told you there were better opportunities out here among the stars." "Something like that," began unpacking his few belongings, arranging them in the small storage compartment beneath his bunk. "My sister needed surgery. The medical costs on Earth are—" He trailed off, not wanting to share too much personal information with strangers. Nodded understandingly. "We've all got our reasons for being out here. The pay is decent, assuming you survive long enough to collect it. The work is dangerous, the equipment is old, and the alien supervisors treat us like disposable tools. But it beats starving on Earth." A younger human, barely out of his teens, looked up from his bunk. "Don't listen to. He's been here too long, and it's made him cynical. Some of the supervisors aren't that bad. There's this one engineer, Kex 9, who actually seems to care whether we live or die." "That's because dead humans mean paperwork," snorted. "And paperwork means delays in production quotas. Don't mistake efficiency for compassion, Tommy." Before could respond, the dormitory door slid open with a hiss. A massive supervisor filled the doorway, his chitinous exoskeleton gleaming under the harsh lights. They were one of the more imposing species in the consortium, standing nearly 8 feet tall with 4 arms and compound eyes that seemed to see everything at once. "New human," the supervisor said, his voice emerging from a complex arrangement of vocal chambers that gave it an unnaturally deep resonance. "I am supervisor. You will report to processing station 7 at 600 hours tomorrow. Shift duration is 12 hours. Safety equipment will be provided, though its effectiveness cannot be guaranteed given human physiological limitations." Stood at attention. "Understood, sir." His compound eyes fixed on him with what might have been amusement. "You are polite for a human. This is unusual. Most of your species are crude and confrontational. Perhaps you will last longer than the previous workers in your assigned position." "How many previous workers were there, sir?" asked carefully. 7 in the past 6 months, replied matter-of-factly. "Mining accidents are common when working with unstable quantum crystal formations. The crystals release unpredictable energy bursts that can overload safety systems designed for more robust alien physiologies. Human nervous systems are particularly vulnerable to quantum interference." With that cheerful news, turned and left, his heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor. The dormitory fell silent for a moment before someone let out a low whistle. 7 in 6 months, Tommy whispered. "That's got to be some kind of record." Patted on the shoulder. "Welcome to paradise, kid. Try not to get yourself killed on the first day." Lay on his narrow bunk that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the station around him. The constant hum of machinery, the distant clank of mining equipment, and the occasional announcement over the intercom created a symphony of industrial noise that made sleep difficult. But it wasn't the noise that kept him awake. It was the knowledge that he was completely alone, millions of miles from home, surrounded by beings who viewed him as little more than an expendable tool. He pulled out the photograph of his sister and her children, studying their faces in the dim emergency lighting. Sarah's medical bills had been climbing for months, and the treatments she needed weren't covered by Earth's basic healthcare system. The money he could make here in a year would be enough to pay for everything, assuming he survived long enough to send it home. The next morning came early, was awakened by harsh klaxon that served as the station's alarm system. Around him, the other humans groaned and rolled out of their bunks, beginning the familiar routine of preparing for another dangerous day in the mines. The communal washing facility was barely functional, providing lukewarm recycled water for exactly 3 minutes before shutting off automatically. Breakfast was served in the station's lower cafeteria, a dimly lit room filled with long metal tables and benches. The human section was segregated from the rest of the dining area by a transparent aluminum barrier, ostensibly for health and safety reasons, though everyone knew it was really to keep the other species from having to look at them while they ate. The food was a gray, protein-rich paste that tasted like cardboard but provided the necessary nutrients for heavy labor. Ate mechanically, trying not to think about the fresh fruit and real meat he had enjoyed back on Earth. Around him, the other humans ate in relative silence, conserving their energy for the long day ahead. "First day jitters?" asked a woman sitting across from him. She was perhaps 40 years old, with short brown hair and intelligent green eyes. Despite the harsh conditions, she maintained an air of quiet dignity that set her apart from some of the more beaten-down workers. "Something like that," replied. "I'm." "Doctor," she said, extending her hand. Former aerospace engineer, current rock breaker, and heavy equipment operator. Don't look so surprised. About half the humans here have advanced degrees. Turns out a D doesn't mean much when your entire planet is considered a backwater by the galactic community. Shook her hand, nodding the calluses that hadn't been there when she was working in a laboratory. What brought you out here? Same thing that brings us all out here, said with a sad smile. Desperation. My research funding was cut when the aliens introduced their superior technology. Apparently, human engineering principles are considered quaint and inefficient. So here I am, using those same supposedly inferior engineering skills to keep their mining equipment running. Their conversation was interrupted by Supervisor's arrival. The massive moved through the cafeteria with purposeful strides, his compound eyes scanning the assembled human workers. Mining teams report to equipment distribution, announced. Production quotas have been increased by 15% this cycle. Failure to meet targets will result in reduced meal allocations and extended shift durations. As the human workers filed out of the cafeteria, noticed how they moved with the weary resignation of people who had long since given up hope of being treated fairly. They formed a line at the equipment distribution center, where another supervisor handed out worn safety gear and mining tools. Received a helmet that had clearly seen better days, its protective coating scratched and worn thin. The oxygen recycler attached to it made ominous clicking sounds when he tested it. His cutting torch was an older model that required frequent, and the quantum scanner he was given had a cracked display that made it difficult to read accurately. Remember, told the assembled workers, quantum crystal formations are highly unstable. Any deviation from standard extraction procedures could result in catastrophic energy release. Human reflexes are inadequate for emergency situations, so you must rely on your equipment to protect you. Do not attempt to be heroic. Dead humans disrupt production schedules. The mining operation was located deep within the planet's crust, accessible only through a series of high-speed elevators that descended for nearly an hour. As they dropped deeper into the planet, could feel the increasing pressure and heat despite the environmental controls of his suit. The walls of the elevator shaft showed the geological history of the planet in layers of different colored rock and crystal formations. At the bottom, the mining operation spread out before them like something from a science fiction nightmare. Massive tunnels stretched off in all directions, lit by harsh artificial lighting that cast long shadows between the support pillars. The air was filled with the sound of drilling equipment, the hiss of hydraulic systems, and the occasional rumble of controlled explosions as new areas were opened up for mining. Was assigned to a team working in Tunnel 7G, one of the deeper excavation sites where the quantum crystals were most abundant. The team consisted of 5 humans and 1 alien supervisor, an engineer named Kex-9 who, according to Tommy, was one of the more reasonable supervisors on the station. Kex-9 was noticeably smaller than Supervisor, with darker coloration on his chitinous shell and what appeared to be more advanced technical equipment integrated into his exoskeleton. When he spoke, his voice had a less intimidating quality, though it still carried the characteristic deep resonance of his species. "Welcome to Tunnel 7G, Kex-9 said as he led them deeper into the excavation site. This section contains some of the richest quantum crystal deposits on the planet, but also some of the most unstable. The crystals here have been known to release energy bursts equivalent to small fusion explosions when improperly handled." He stopped beside a wall of rock that seemed to glow with an inner light. Embedded within it were dozens of crystalline formations, each one pulsing with a different color and rhythm. The sight was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. "Your job is to extract these crystals intact while minimizing disturbance to the surrounding formations," Kex-9 continued. "Each crystal must be carefully separated from the matrix rock and placed in the provided containment units. The quantum scanners will help you identify stable cutting points, but ultimately you must rely on your experience and instincts." Studied the wall of crystals, noting the complex patterns of energy flow that connected them to each other. His years of experience in asteroid mining had taught him to read the subtle signs that indicated structural weakness or instability in mineral formations. Here, those same principles applied, but the stakes were much higher. "What happens if we trigger an energy release?" asked one of the other workers, a nervous-looking man named. Kex-9's compound eyes fixed on him. "If you are fortunate, Your safety equipment will protect you from the worst effects, and you will suffer only minor burns and temporary neural disruption. If you are less fortunate. He gestured toward a memorial plaque mounted on the tunnel wall, listing the names of workers who had been killed in mining accidents over the past year. The human names far outnumbered those of other species. For the next several hours, worked carefully with his cutting torch, following the guidance of his quantum scanner to identify the safest extraction points. The work was incredibly delicate, requiring steady hands and constant attention to the energy readings. One mistake could trigger a chain reaction that would destroy the entire crystal formation and potentially collapse part of the tunnel. As he worked, became aware that Kex-9 was watching him more closely than the other workers. The engineer seemed genuinely interested in his technique, occasionally offering suggestions or pointing out subtle details that the quantum scanner might have missed. "You have experience with precision mining," Kex-9 observed during a brief rest break. "Your movements are more controlled than most humans." "I worked the asteroid belts for 6 years before coming here," replied, grateful for the opportunity to talk to someone who didn't seem to view him with outright contempt. "Asteroid mining requires a lot of precision work, especially when you're dealing with valuable minerals embedded in unstable rock formations." Kex-9 made a sound that might have been interest. Asteroid mining is considered quite dangerous, even by consortium standards. Most species avoid such work due to the high risk factors. "Humans are good at dangerous work," said quietly. "We don't have much choice in the matter." Something in his tone seemed to catch Kex-9's attention. The engineer studied him for a moment before responding. "You speak as though your species has been deliberately relegated to such positions." Realized he had said too much. Criticizing the consortium's treatment of humans was a sure way to get himself marked as a troublemaker and sent home on the next transport. "I just meant that we're willing to take on challenging assignments." But Kex-9 seemed to see through his diplomatic response. For a moment, the alien's compound eyes showed something that might have been understanding or even sympathy. Then the moment passed and they returned to work. The rest of the day proceeded without incident. Successfully extracted 17 quantum crystals, each one carefully placed in its containment unit and logged into the production database. It wasn't a spectacular output, but it was steady and consistent work that met the minimum quotas without taking unnecessary risks. As the shift ended and the team prepared to return to the surface, noticed that one of the other workers was struggling with his final crystal extraction. The nervous man's hands were shaking as he tried to position his cutting torch, and his quantum scanner was showing increasingly unstable readings. "Stop," called out. "That formation is too unstable. Leave it for the next shift." But perhaps driven by fear of not meeting his quota, continued working. The quantum scanner began emitting urgent warning beeps, and the crystal formation started glowing more brightly. "Everyone out," Kex-9 shouted, his 4 arms moving quickly to gather emergency equipment. "Energy cascade building." The team scrambled toward the tunnel exit, but was still at his workstation, frantically trying to complete the extraction before the crystal destabilized completely. Could see that the man was frozen by panic, unable to make the rational decision to abandon his work and save himself. Without thinking, dropped his equipment and ran back toward. The quantum readings were now in the red zone, and the air around the crystal formation was beginning to shimmer with released energy. He grabbed by the shoulders and physically dragged him away from the workstation just as the entire crystal wall erupted in a brilliant explosion of light and sound. The energy blast knocked both men to the ground, their safety equipment struggling to protect them from the quantum interference. Felt a burning sensation across his back where the energy had penetrated his worn protective gear, and his vision flickered as his helmet systems were temporarily overloaded. When his sight cleared, he found Kex-9 standing over them, his advanced equipment already scanning for injuries. The engineer's compound eyes were focused intently on, and there was something in his expression that hadn't been there before. "That was extremely dangerous," Kex-9 said quietly. "Your safety protocols clearly state that workers should prioritize their own survival over equipment or quotas." Struggled to his feet, helping up beside him. "Was in trouble, I couldn't just leave him." "Most species would have," Kex-9 replied. "Self-preservation is considered the highest priority in dangerous situations. Your behavior is," he paused, seeming to search for the right word, "unexpected." As they made their way back to the surface, couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in how Kex 9 looked at him. For the first time since arriving at the station, he had the sense that an alien had seen him as something more than just a replaceable tool. It was a small thing, perhaps insignificant in the larger scheme of the galaxy's treatment of humanity, but it gave him a tiny spark of hope that not all aliens viewed his species with complete contempt. That night in the dormitory, word of the incident had already spread among the human workers. Some praised for his heroism, while others criticized him for taking unnecessary risks. Was firmly in the latter camp. "You could have been killed," the older man said bluntly. "And for what? To save, the company would have just brought in another worker to replace him. They always do." "Maybe," replied, tending to the burns on his back with the limited medical supplies available in their quarters. "But I couldn't live with myself if I had just stood by and watched him die." Doctor looked up from her bunk, where she was reading a technical manual on quantum crystal formations. "That's what makes us human," she said quietly. "We risk ourselves for others, even when it's not logical or practical. The aliens see that as a weakness, but maybe it's actually our greatest strength." Thought about her words as he lay in his bunk that night. Outside his small porthole, he could see the stars scattered across the darkness of space, each one representing worlds and civilizations that viewed humanity as inferior. But perhaps Doctor was right. Perhaps the qualities that the aliens dismissed as primitive, compassion, self-sacrifice, the willingness to help others even at personal cost, were actually what made humans special. He pulled out the photograph of his sister and her children, studying their faces in the dim light. Sarah had always been proud of his work, even when it took him far from home and into dangerous situations. She understood that sometimes people had to take risks to help the ones they loved. Tomorrow he would go back into the tunnels, back to the dangerous work of extracting quantum crystals from unstable formations. But tonight, for 3 weeks had passed since the crystal explosion in Tunnel 7G and had settled into the rhythm of life on the mining station. Each morning brought the same routine: the harsh klaxon alarm, the communal washing facility with its 3 minutes of lukewarm water, and the gray protein paste that passed for breakfast. Then came the long descent into the planet's depths, where he spent 12 hours carefully extracting quantum crystals from increasingly unstable formations. His reputation among the human workers had grown. Word of his rescue had spread throughout Section C7, and new arrivals often sought him out for advice about surviving their first few weeks on the station. Found himself becoming an unofficial mentor, sharing tips about reading quantum scanner displays and identifying dangerous energy buildups in crystal formations. But it wasn't just the humans who had begun to notice. Kex 9 had started assigning him to the more challenging extraction sites, positions that typically went to workers with years of experience. The engineer never explained his reasoning, but suspected it had something to do with their conversation after the explosion. On this particular morning, as suited up for another day in the tunnels, Kex 9 approached him with what appeared to be a new piece of equipment. The said, his 4 arms deftly handling the device. "You will be testing this prototype quantum scanner today. It has been designed with improved sensitivity for detecting energy fluctuations in unstable crystal formations." Examined the scanner, nodding its sleeker design and more advanced display system. "Is this standard equipment for all workers?" "No," Kex 9 replied. "This scanner was developed specifically for operators with proven precision and reliability. You will be the first to field test it in active mining conditions." The other workers in his team looked at him with a mixture of envy and suspicion. Getting assigned new equipment was almost unheard of for human workers, who typically received whatever gear the other species had discarded or deemed too obsolete to use safely. As they descended into Tunnel 7G, couldn't shake the feeling that this assignment was about more than just testing equipment. The prototype scanner was clearly more advanced than anything he had seen before, with capabilities that seemed to go far beyond what was necessary for basic crystal extraction. When he activated it, the display showed detailed 3-dimensional maps of the quantum energy flows throughout the entire tunnel system, information that could be invaluable for planning large-scale mining operations. Their first extraction site was a particularly challenging formation where several different types of crystals had grown together in a complex matrix. The standard approach would have been to extract each crystal individually, a process that could take hours and carried significant risk of triggering energy cascades. But the new scanner showed something interesting. There were natural stress points in the formation where a single, carefully placed cut could separate the entire cluster without disturbing the energy flows. Kex 9 called out, pointing to his scanner display. I'm reading some unusual patterns in this formation. The energy flows seem to follow specific pathways that might allow for more efficient extraction. The engineer moved closer, his compound eyes studying the scanner readout. Show me. Highlighted the pathways on his display, explaining how the energy moved through the crystal matrix and identifying the points where surgical cuts could isolate entire sections without triggering instability. As he spoke, he became aware that the other workers had stopped their own tasks to listen. Even, who had been nervous around energy-active formations ever since the explosion, seemed fascinated by the analysis. Your interpretation is? Kex 9 paused, as if struggling with the concept. Sophisticated. Most workers follow standard extraction protocols without attempting to understand the underlying quantum mechanics. Understanding the science makes the work safer, replied. If you know why something works, you're better prepared when it doesn't work the way you expect. Kex 9 made a sound that had learned to recognize as the equivalent of thoughtful consideration. Proceed with your suggested extraction sequence. I will monitor the results. What followed was the most efficient crystal extraction had ever witnessed. By following the energy pathways revealed by the advanced scanner, he was able to remove the entire formation in less than half the time it would have taken using standard protocols. Moreover, the extracted crystals showed higher purity ratings than typical, since they hadn't been stressed by lengthy cutting procedures. Word of the successful extraction spread quickly through the tunnel complex. Other supervisors began arriving to observe work, their alien features showing various degrees of curiosity and skepticism. Among them was Supervisor, whose imposing presence made the other workers visibly nervous. The human is exceeding productivity targets by 37%, noted, reviewing the data on his own scanner. This level of efficiency is unusual for his species. Has demonstrated exceptional understanding of quantum crystal mechanics, Kex 9 replied carefully. His techniques could potentially be adapted for use throughout the mining operation. Continued working, trying to ignore the attention while focusing on the delicate task of crystal extraction. But he couldn't help overhearing the conversation between the two supervisors, and what he heard made him uncomfortable. Human workers are not typically considered suitable for advanced technical positions, said. Their cognitive limitations and lack of formal education make them unreliable for complex operations. Perhaps our assumptions about human capabilities require reevaluation, Kex 9 suggested quietly. His compound eyes fixed on with what might have been surprise. You believe this individual represents a statistical anomaly rather than evidence of broader human potential. I believe, Kex 9 said carefully, that we may not have provided humans with adequate opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities. The conversation ended there, but could feel the weight of attention for the rest of the shift. He worked with extra care, double-checking every cut and measurement, knowing that any mistake would be used to confirm the supervisor's preconceptions about human incompetence. During the lunch break, found himself sitting alone in a corner of the tunnel's rest area, reviewing the day's extraction data on his scanner. The prototype device had recorded everything, creating a detailed log of his techniques and their results. As he scrolled through the information, he noticed patterns that even he hadn't been aware of while working. You are studying your own performance, observed a voice beside him. Looked up to see Kex 9 approaching, his 4 arms carrying what appeared to be a portable analysis station. Trying to understand why some extractions went better than others, replied. The scanner recorded a lot of data I didn't have time to process during the actual work. Kex 9 set up his analysis station beside's bench. Show me what you have discovered. For the next 20 minutes, walked Kex 9 through his findings. He pointed out correlations between crystal purity and extraction speed, identified environmental factors that affected energy stability, and suggested modifications to standard protocols that could improve both safety and efficiency. As he spoke, he became aware that his understanding of the mining process had evolved far beyond what was typically expected of a human worker. Your analysis is remarkably thorough, Kex 9 said when finished. Have you had formal training in quantum mechanics or crystallography? No formal training, admitted. Just 6 years of practical experience in asteroid mining, plus whatever I could learn from technical manuals and observation. Self-taught, Kex-9 mused. This is unusual among humans. Most of your species seem content to perform simple, repetitive tasks without seeking deeper understanding. Felt a flash of irritation at the casual prejudice in the statement, but he forced himself to respond diplomatically. Maybe we just haven't been given many opportunities to learn. When you're focused on survival and meeting quotas, there isn't much time for theoretical study. Kex-9's compound eyes studied for a long moment. An interesting perspective. Tell me, what would you do if you had unlimited access to educational resources and time to study? The question caught off guard. No alien had ever asked him about his aspirations or interests beyond his immediate work assignments. I'd want to understand how everything connects, he said finally. The quantum mechanics, the geology, the engineering systems that keep this place running. It all fits together somehow, and I think understanding the whole picture would make every part of the job safer and more efficient. And if you could design improvements to current mining operations. Hesitated, unsure if this was a trap. But Kex-9 seemed genuinely curious, so he decided to be honest. I'd start with better integration between the geological surveys and the extraction protocols. Right now, we're working almost blind, following standard procedures without really understanding what makes each formation unique. If we had better data about the quantum field interactions, we could customize our approach for each site. As spoke, he noticed that Kex-9 was recording their conversation on his analysis station. The realization made him nervous, but it was too late to take back his words. Your suggestions demonstrate sophisticated understanding of complex systems, Kex-9 said when finished. Such insights are typically associated with advanced engineering education. Like I said, I'm self-taught. When you're working with dangerous equipment in a hostile environment, you learn fast or you don't survive. The rest of the lunch break passed in relative silence, but could feel that something had shifted in his relationship with Kex-9. The engineer seemed to be evaluating him for something beyond his current role as a crystal extractor. It was both exciting and terrifying to think that an alien supervisor might be considering him for more advanced responsibilities. The afternoon shift brought new challenges. His team was assigned to work in a section of tunnel that had been abandoned 6 months earlier due to unstable quantum readings. The area was being reopened because geological surveys suggested it contained some of the richest crystal deposits on the planet, but the environmental conditions were unlike anything had encountered before. The crystals in this section weren't just energy active. They seemed to be resonating with each other in complex patterns that created interference waves throughout the tunnel. Standard extraction techniques were proving ineffective, and 2 other teams had already been forced to retreat after triggering minor energy cascades. This is beyond our capabilities, said nervously, his quantum scanner showing wildly fluctuating readings. We should report back to Kex-9 and request reassignment. But was studying the interference patterns on his prototype scanner, seeing something that the others had missed. The resonance waves weren't random. They followed a mathematical progression that suggested an underlying order to the crystal network. Wait, he said, holding up a hand to stop the team from retreating. Look at this. He activated the scanner's holographic display, projecting a 3-dimensional map of the quantum field interactions throughout the tunnel section. At first, it looked like chaos, energy flowing in seemingly random directions, creating interference patterns that made individual crystal extraction nearly impossible. But as adjusted the display parameters, a different picture emerged. The crystals are networked, he breathed, understanding flooding through him. They're not individual formations, they're all part of a single integrated system. That's why standard extraction techniques aren't working. We've been trying to remove components from a functioning machine. Doctor, who had been assigned to his team for this shift, moved closer to study the display. If that's true, then removing crystals randomly would be like pulling components out of a computer while it's running. No wonder we've been triggering energy cascades. But if we understand the network, continued, his excitement growing, we might be able to extract entire sections safely by following the natural connection points. He began highlighting pathways on the holographic display, tracing the quantum field flows from their source crystals to their termination points. It was like solving a 3-dimensional puzzle, but one where the pieces were made of pure energy and a single mistake could kill everyone in the tunnel. Called Kex-9's voice over the team's communication system. Report your status. You have been stationary for an extended period. Activated his. Kex-9, I think we found something important. The crystal formations in this section aren't behaving like individual deposits. They appear to be components of a larger networked system. There was a pause before Kex-9 responded. Explain. The resonance patterns aren't interference. They're communication. The crystals are exchanging quantum information in a structured format. If we can map the network topology, we might be able to extract entire clusters without disrupting the system's stability. Another pause, longer this time. Maintain your current position. I am coming to examine your findings personally. When Kex-9 arrived 10 minutes later, he was accompanied by two other aliens hadn't seen before. One was clearly another, but with gold-colored markings on his exoskeleton that suggested high rank. The other was a member of the ethereal species, tall, graceful beings with translucent skin and large, luminous eyes that seemed to see everything at once. Kex-9 said formally, "This is Chief Engineer Vex-5 and Research Specialist. They have come to evaluate your analysis of the quantum network phenomenon." Felt his mouth go dry. Chief Engineer was one of the highest positions on the station, and research specialists were typically reserved for the most advanced scientific problems. The fact that these high-ranking aliens were here to examine his work was both thrilling and terrifying. Chief Engineer Vex-5 examined the holographic display with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to complex technical problems. His compound eyes moved in precise patterns as he analyzed the quantum field mappings, occasionally making notes on a sophisticated recording device. The network topology is more complex than our initial geological surveys suggested, Vex-5 said finally. How did you identify the communication protocols? Swallowed hard before responding. I noticed that the interference patterns weren't random. They showed mathematical progressions similar to the communication systems I worked with in the asteroid mining operations. Once I adjusted for the quantum effects, the underlying structure became visible. Research specialist stepped forward, her luminous eyes studying with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. The ethereals were known for their advanced mental capabilities, and many humans found their attention overwhelming. Your species typically demonstrates limited capacity for pattern recognition in quantum systems, said in her musical voice. Your analysis suggests cognitive abilities that exceed established parameters for human intelligence. Wasn't sure if that was a compliment or an accusation. I just used the tools available and tried to understand what I was seeing. Simplicity can often reveal truths that complexity obscures, replied, which sounded like philosophy but felt like an evaluation. For the next hour, found himself explaining his techniques and reasoning to the three alien officials. They asked detailed questions about his analytical process, his understanding of quantum mechanics, and his suggestions for safely extracting the networked crystals. It was the most intense technical discussion he had ever had with aliens, and he was acutely aware that his responses might determine not just his own future, but possibly the way humans were viewed throughout the station. When the questioning finally ended, Chief Engineer Vex-5 and research specialist to a private area of the tunnel to discuss their findings. Could see them engaged in animated conversation, their alien gestures and expressions impossible for him to interpret. You have impressed them, Kex-9 said quietly while they waited. This level of interest from senior staff is unprecedented for a human worker. Is that good or bad? Asked, his anxiety growing. Unknown, change brings both opportunities and risks. Your analysis may result in advancement, or it may result in closer scrutiny that could prove uncomfortable. The comment sent a chill down spine. He had heard stories about human workers who had drawn too much attention from the alien authorities. Some had simply disappeared, transferred to other stations without warning. Others had been subjected to extensive testing and evaluation that had left them psychologically damaged. When Vex-5 and returned, their expressions were unreadable. The chief engineer activated a portable communication device and spoke briefly in the language before switching back to Galactic Standard. Vex-5 said formally, "Your analysis of the quantum network phenomenon has been forwarded to the Consortium Research Council. You will be temporarily reassigned to Research Division while they evaluate your findings, and their implications for mining operations throughout this sector. Felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Research Division was staffed entirely by aliens with advanced degrees and specialized training. He was just a human laborer with a 6th-grade education and some practical mining experience. "Sir," he said carefully, "I think there might be some mistake. I don't have the qualifications for research work." "Qualifications are determined by demonstrated capability, not by formal credentials," research specialist said. "Your analysis has revealed previously unknown characteristics of quantum crystal behavior. Such insights are valuable regardless of their source." As the alien officials prepared to leave, Kex-9 approached one final time. "You will report to Research Division tomorrow at 800 hours. Doctor will be your supervisor. Do not disappoint her." Kex-9 called out as the engineer turned to go. "Thank you for the opportunities, the equipment, everything. I know you didn't have to." Kex-9 paused, his compound eyes meeting human ones. "Potential should be recognized and developed, regardless of species. Perhaps it is time the consortium learned this lesson." That evening in the dormitory, news of reassignment spread through the human quarters like wildfire. Reactions were mixed. Some saw it as a victory for their entire species, proof that humans could succeed in technical positions if given the chance. Others worried that was being set up for failure, used as an example to reinforce stereotypes about human limitations. "They're going to put you under a microscope," warned. "Every mistake will be, every success dismissed as luck or alien assistance. You'll be representing all of us up there." Doctor had a different perspective. "This is exactly what we need," she said firmly. "Someone with real talent getting the chance to show what humans can accomplish when we're not deliberately held back. Don't let them intimidate you. You earned this opportunity." As packed his few belongings in preparation for moving to new quarters in the Research Division, he couldn't help thinking about the photograph of his sister and her children. Sarah had always believed he was capable of great things, even when he couldn't see it himself. Now he had a chance to prove her right, not just for himself, but for all of humanity. The prospect was both exhilarating and terrifying. Tomorrow, he would begin working alongside some of the most brilliant minds in the galaxy, beings whose intelligence had been considered superior to humans for as long as the two species had known about each other. He would have access to equipment and information that most humans could only dream of, along with the opportunity to make real contributions to scientific understanding. But he would also be under constant scrutiny, his every action evaluated for evidence of human capability or limitation. The weight of representing his entire species was almost overwhelming, but it was also motivating. If he could succeed, if he could prove that humans deserved better treatment and more opportunities, then all the risks would be worthwhile. As he lay in his bunk for what might be the last time, stared out the small porthole at the stars beyond. Somewhere out there was Earth, where his sister was waiting for the money that would pay for her medical treatments. Somewhere out there were billions of other humans, most of whom would never have the chance he was being given. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, he would begin the most challenging period of his life. But tonight, for the first time since leaving Earth, felt genuinely hopeful about the future. He had proven that humans could excel when given proper tools and opportunities. Now he had the chance to prove it on a much larger stage, with implications that could change the way the entire galaxy viewed his species. The Research Division occupied an entirely different section of the mining station, separated from the industrial areas by multiple security checkpoints and access controls. As made his way through the sterile corridors on his first morning, he couldn't help but notice the stark contrast to the cramped, utilitarian spaces where the human workers lived. Here, the walls were lined with smooth panels that seemed to glow with their own inner light, and the air was clean and odorless, maintained by advanced filtration systems that created an almost ethereal atmosphere. His new quarters were beyond anything he had imagined. Instead of a cramped bunk in a shared dormitory, he had been assigned a private room with actual windows that looked out onto the planet's surface. The furniture was designed for comfort rather than mere functionality, and there was even a small workspace equipped with a personal terminal connected to the station's research network. But the most shocking change was the food. The research facility had its own dining area, where meals were prepared fresh using a variety of ingredients that hadn't seen since leaving Earth. Real vegetables, actual meat, and even fresh fruit were available alongside more exotic alien dishes that provided nutrition tailored to the specific needs of different species. As entered the dining area for breakfast, conversations stopped and heads turned to stare at him. He was clearly the only human in the entire facility, surrounded by dozens of alien researchers from species he recognized, and several he didn't. The attention was uncomfortable, but he forced himself to walk calmly to the food distribution area and select a simple meal of familiar items. "You must be the human who discovered the quantum network phenomenon," said a voice behind him. Turned to see a tall, elegant being with the characteristic features of the species: elongated skull, large black eyes, and pale, almost translucent skin. "I am Doctor, Senior Researcher in Quantum Crystallography. We will be working together on the analysis of your findings." Introduced himself and followed Doctor to a table near the large windows overlooking the planet's surface. As they sat down, several other researchers approached, their expressions ranging from curious to skeptical. "Doctor has briefed us on your background," said a researcher with distinctive blue-tinted crystalline skin. "Self-taught asteroid miner with no formal education in quantum physics or crystallography, most unusual for someone assigned to our division." The comment stung, but had expected this kind of reception. "I understand my background is unconventional. I'm here to learn and contribute however I can." "Practical experience can sometimes provide insights that theoretical study misses," Doctor said diplomatically. "We look forward to examining your analytical techniques." The first few hours in the research division were overwhelming. Was given access to computer systems that contained more scientific data than he had ever imagined existed, libraries of research papers on quantum mechanics and crystal formation that would take years to read completely. Doctor provided him with what she called a basic orientation to the current state of quantum crystallography research, but even the supposedly basic concepts were far more advanced than anything he had encountered before. "The quantum network phenomenon you identified appears to be unique to the crystal formations in this planetary system," Doctor explained, as they stood before a massive holographic display showing the internal structure of the mining tunnels. "Previous surveys failed to detect the networking behavior because our scanning techniques were not sophisticated enough to recognize the communication protocols." Studied the display, noting patterns that were similar to what he had observed in the tunnels, but far more complex when viewed on the scale. "The networking seems to extend beyond individual tunnel sections. Are these formations connected throughout the entire mining operation?" "That is what we are attempting to determine," Doctor replied. "Your initial discovery suggests that we may have been mining components of a planet-wide quantum intelligence system without realizing it." The implications of that statement hit like a physical blow. If the crystals formed some kind of intelligence system, then the mining operation might be inadvertently damaging or destroying a sentient being. The ethical considerations were staggering, but he could see from the expressions of the alien researchers that they were approaching this as a purely scientific problem. "What happens to the research if we confirm that the crystal network is sentient?" asked carefully. Doctor's luminous eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Sentience is a complex concept with many definitions. The consortium has specific protocols for dealing with newly discovered intelligence, but those protocols typically apply to biological life forms rather than crystalline structures." It wasn't exactly an answer to his question, and suspected that the ethical implications were being deliberately avoided in favor of the scientific opportunities. He made a mental note to be careful about how he expressed his concerns going forward. The next several days were spent in intensive analysis of the quantum network data. Found himself working alongside some of the most brilliant minds in the galaxy, beings whose intelligence and education far exceeded anything available to humans. But as the work progressed, he began to notice something interesting. While the alien researchers were certainly more knowledgeable about theoretical quantum mechanics, they sometimes missed practical details that seemed obvious to him. "The energy flow patterns in Section 7G are inconsistent with our mathematical models," Doctor announced during one of their daily briefing meetings. "The quantum field equations predict a symmetric distribution, but the actual readings show significant asymmetries that we cannot account for." Looked at the holographic display showing the problematic section. "That's where the explosion happened 3 weeks ago," he said. The energy cascade one was trying to extract that unstable crystal formation. Ah, Doctor said, making notes on his data pad. Previous mining activity, that would explain the field distortions. Not just the mining activity, continued, studying the display more carefully. Look at the pattern of the asymmetries. They're not random. They follow the same mathematical progression as the communication protocols in the undisturbed sections, just at a different frequency. The alien researchers exchanged glances that couldn't interpret. Doctor activated additional display layers, showing quantum field measurements from both before and after the explosion. You are suggesting that the network compensated for the damaged section by rerouting communication pathways through alternative crystal formations, she asked. It looks like it to me, replied. The network didn't just lose functionality when those crystals were destroyed, it adapted. That's not something you'd expect from a passive crystalline structure. The implications of his observation sent a wave of excitement through the research team. If the quantum network was capable of adaptation and self-repair, it represented a level of sophistication that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of intelligence and consciousness. Over the following weeks, found himself becoming increasingly integrated into the research team. His practical mining experience proved invaluable for understanding the real-world implications of their theoretical discoveries, and his intuitive grasp of pattern recognition allowed him to spot details that others missed. But more importantly, he began to notice that his perspective as a human was fundamentally different from that of his alien colleagues. The alien researchers approached problems with logical, systematic methodologies that were remarkably effective for analyzing known phenomena. But when faced with something truly unprecedented, like the quantum network, their rigid thinking patterns sometimes prevented them from seeing possibilities that didn't fit established theories. On the other hand, had spent years working in unpredictable environments where survival depended on adaptability and creative problem-solving. His lack of formal education, which the aliens saw as a limitation, actually freed him from preconceptions that might have restricted his thinking. The networking behavior extends far beyond what we initially suspected, Doctor announced during a major briefing attended by station leadership. Based on our analysis of quantum field data from throughout the mining operation, we have confirmed that the crystal formations constitute a single, integrated intelligence system spanning the entire planet. Chief Engineer Vex 5, who had been following the research closely, leaned forward in his chair. What are the implications for mining operations? That depends on how we choose to interpret our findings, Doctor replied carefully. From a purely technical standpoint, the intelligence system could potentially be harvested intact, rather than being destroyed through conventional mining. The quantum processing power represented by this network would be invaluable for consortium research and development. Felt his stomach clench. The casual discussion of harvesting a sentient being's intelligence was chilling, but he could see that none of the alien researchers seemed troubled by the ethical implications. What about communication? Asked, drawing surprised looks from the assembled aliens. If this is truly an intelligence system, shouldn't we try to establish contact before making decisions about harvesting or mining? Research specialist's expression became unreadable. Communication would require sophisticated translation protocols and extensive time investment. Such efforts would significantly delay mining operations and reduce projected profits for this quarter. But if it's sentient? Sentience, as I have explained, is a complex concept, Doctor interrupted. The consortium's definition of intelligence requiring protection typically applies to biological entities capable of independent movement and social organization. Crystalline intelligence systems are not explicitly covered by existing protocols. Realized that he was witnessing a carefully constructed rationalization for what amounted to the murder of a sentient being. The aliens weren't failing to recognize the ethical implications. They were deliberately choosing to ignore them in favor of scientific and economic benefits. That evening, alone in his quarters, stared out at the planet's surface while grappling with the most difficult decision of his life. He had achieved more in the past month than any human in galactic history, earning recognition and respect from beings who had previously viewed his species as barely intelligent. He had access to knowledge and opportunities that could benefit all of humanity, and his success was already changing how some aliens viewed human capabilities. But all of that would be meaningless if he stood by and watched while a sentient being was destroyed for profit. The quantum intelligence might be unlike any form of life that humans had encountered before, but it was still alive in its own way, and it deserved protection. The problem was that he had no authority to stop the mining operation and no way to convince the alien authorities to change their plans. As a human, his opinions carried little weight in consortium decision-making, and speaking out too forcefully could result in his immediate removal from the research team. But perhaps there was another way. Activated his personal terminal and began accessing the quantum network data he had helped to analyze. If the crystalline intelligence was truly capable of communication, then maybe he could find a way to establish contact himself. It would be dangerous. Unauthorized access to research data could result in severe punishment, but it might be the only chance to save a unique form of life from destruction. The communication protocols he had identified followed mathematical patterns similar to those used in human computer networks, but with quantum properties that made them far more sophisticated. By adapting signal processing techniques from his asteroid mining experience, he might be able to create a basic interface that would allow two-way communication with the planet-wide intelligence. Working through the night, wrote a simple program that could translate basic mathematical concepts into quantum field fluctuations and interpret responses using pattern recognition algorithms. It wasn't sophisticated enough for complex communication, but it might allow for the exchange of simple ideas and emotions. When he finally activated the program, routing it through the station's quantum sensor array, held his breath as he waited for a response. For several minutes, nothing happened except for the normal background fluctuations of the crystal network's internal communication. Then, slowly, the pattern began to change. The response was unlike anything he had expected. Instead of mathematical symbols or logical structures, he received what could only be described as music, complex harmonic patterns that conveyed emotions and concepts in ways that transcended language. The intelligence was trying to communicate, reaching out across the vast differences between biological and crystalline consciousness to make contact with another thinking being. As the communication continued, began to understand that the crystalline intelligence was not just aware of the mining operation. It was in pain. Each crystal extraction was like having pieces of its mind torn away, and the recent increase in mining activity had caused levels of suffering that it could barely endure. Yet despite the agony, it had been trying to communicate with the miners, hoping to make them understand that they were hurting a living being. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Every crystal he had extracted, every formation he had helped to mine, had caused suffering to this vast intelligence. The aliens knew, or at least suspected, what they were doing, but they had chosen to ignore the ethical implications in favor of profit and scientific advancement. But the crystalline intelligence wasn't just reaching out to express its pain. It was also sharing something else: hope. It had detected human thought patterns, so different from those of the other species on the station, and it sensed in him a potential ally who might understand the value of preserving life even when that life was different from one's own. Through the quantum communication link, experienced flashes of the intelligence's vast consciousness, a mind that had been developing for millions of years, accumulating knowledge and wisdom while slowly growing throughout the planet's crystalline matrix. It had watched the stars change in their courses, had observed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, and had dreamed of someday making contact with other intelligent beings among the stars. The mining operation was destroying not just a sentient being, but a repository of cosmic knowledge that could benefit the entire galaxy if it were preserved and protected. The crystalline intelligence was offering to share its accumulated wisdom with other species, but only if they could learn to see it as a partner rather than a resource to be exploited. Found himself crying as he experienced the intelligence's mixture of hope and despair, its longing for understanding, and its fear of being destroyed before anyone recognized its true nature. The tears surprised him. He hadn't cried since leaving Earth, having learned to suppress his emotions in the face of the daily humiliations and hardships of human life in the consortium. But this was different. This was grief for a dying world mind that had waited eons for contact, only to find beings who saw it as nothing more than valuable minerals to be extracted. "I'm sorry," he whispered to his computer terminal, knowing that the quantum communication link would carry his emotions along with his words. "I'm so sorry we didn't know. But I'll try to help. I'll find a way to make them understand. The response came as a wave of gratitude so profound that it nearly overwhelmed him. The crystalline intelligence had been alone for so long that even the promise of someone trying to help was enough to provide comfort in its darkest moment. But the communication session ended abruptly as alarms began sounding throughout the research facility. Quickly shut down his improvised communication program, but he realized that the quantum sensor array had probably recorded everything. His unauthorized contact with the crystalline intelligence would be discovered, and the consequences would be severe. Within minutes, security personnel arrived at his quarters. They were enforcement officers, their imposing presence making small rooms seem even more cramped. Behind them came Doctor, her luminous eyes showing a mixture of disappointment and what might have been fear. Doctor said formally, "You are under arrest for unauthorized access to research data and violation of communication protocols. You will be held pending investigation into your activities." As the security officers placed restraints on his wrists, looked out his window one last time at the planet's surface. Somewhere far below, a vast intelligence was waiting to see if the brief contact they had shared would lead to salvation, or if it would die alone, misunderstood and unrecognized by the very beings it had hoped to befriend. The crystalline intelligence had placed its faith in him, trusting that one human might succeed where entire civilizations had failed. Now he was about to face the full weight of the consortium's justice system, with little hope of convincing anyone that a planet-sized collection of crystals deserved the same consideration as biological life. But as the security officers led him away from his quarters, felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time since leaving Earth, he had done something truly meaningful, something that mattered more than survival or personal advancement. He had made contact with another intelligent being, had shared a moment of understanding across the vast gulf between different forms of consciousness. Even if he failed to save the crystalline intelligence, even if his actions led to his imprisonment or worse, he had proven something important about the nature of consciousness and compassion. Intelligence and empathy weren't limited to any particular species or form of life. They were universal principles that could bridge any gap, no matter how vast. The aliens might see him as just another primitive human who had overstepped his boundaries, but knew better. He was a representative of a species that valued life in all its forms, that could recognize consciousness even when it appeared in unexpected places, and that was willing to sacrifice for the sake of justice and compassion. As the security officers led him through the pristine corridors of the research division, thought about his sister Sarah and her children back on Earth. He had come to the mining station to earn money for her medical treatments, but he had found something far more valuable, proof that humans had something unique to offer the galaxy, something that their supposed intellectual superiors seemed to lack. The road ahead would be difficult, perhaps impossible, but the crystalline intelligence was still alive, still hopping, and as long as that hope remained, would continue fighting for its survival. He might be just one human facing the entire consortium, but sometimes one person with the courage to stand the detention facility was located in the deepest levels of the mining station, far below even the human quarters in Section C7. Found himself in a small, sterile cell with walls made of some kind of energy-dampening material that blocked all electronic signals. There were no windows, no personal belongings allowed, and no contact with the outside world except for the daily visits from his interrogators. Doctor came first, her luminous eyes studying with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under a microscope. She was accompanied by a consortium legal officer, a member of a species didn't recognize, tall and thin with metallic skin and eyes like black diamonds. The legal officer began, consulting a datapad with fluid, precise movements. "You are charged with unauthorized access to classified research data, violation of communication protocols, and potential sabotage of mining operations. These charges carry significant penalties under consortium law." "I wasn't trying to sabotage anything," replied, keeping his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I was trying to establish communication with the crystalline intelligence." Doctor leaned forward slightly. "Why did you feel this was necessary? The research team was already analyzing the communication protocols as part of our standard investigation." Chose his words carefully. "Because the intelligence is in pain. Every crystal we extract is causing its suffering, and it's been trying to communicate that fact to us. I thought if we could establish direct contact, we might find a way to mine the crystals without causing harm. The legal officer's black diamond eyes seemed to glitter with amusement. You believe that a crystalline structure is capable of experiencing pain. This is a remarkable claim from someone with no formal education in consciousness theory or xenobiology. I experienced its pain directly through the quantum communication link, said. The intelligence isn't just aware, it's been trying to tell us what the mining is doing to it. Describe this alleged communication in detail, Doctor commanded. For the next 3 hours, recounted every moment of his contact with the crystalline intelligence. He described the musical patterns that conveyed emotion, the flashes of vast consciousness spanning millions of years, and the profound loneliness of a being that had waited eons for contact with other intelligent life. As he spoke, both interrogators took detailed notes, their expressions remaining carefully neutral. Your description suggests either an extremely sophisticated form of consciousness or an elaborate delusion brought on by exposure to quantum field fluctuations, the legal officer concluded when finished. Without corroborating evidence, your claims cannot be substantiated. The evidence is in the communication logs, protested. The quantum sensor array recorded everything. Doctor exchanged a glance with the legal officer. The sensor logs show unusual quantum field patterns during your unauthorized access, but these could be explained by equipment malfunction or deliberate manipulation of the data. There is no proof that the patterns represent communication from an intelligent source. Felt his heart sink. They were dismissing his evidence without serious consideration, just as he had feared they would. What about the self-repair capabilities we documented? The way the network rerouted communication pathways after the explosion? That proves the system is capable of adaptive responses. Adaptive responses can be programmed into non-sentient systems, the legal officer replied dismissively. Sophisticated artificial intelligence can mimic consciousness without actually possessing it. Your interpretation of the data, while creative, is not supported by established scientific principles. The interrogation continued for days, with different officials taking turns questioning about his background, his motivations, and his understanding of the quantum network phenomenon. They seemed particularly interested in whether he had been influenced by other humans or if his actions represented a broader conspiracy among the human workers. Found it grimly ironic that they were more concerned about human plotting than they were about the possibility that they were destroying a sentient being. To the consortium authorities, the idea that humans might be capable of organizing effective resistance was more believable than the possibility that a crystalline structure could be truly conscious. On the 5th day of his detention, received an unexpected visitor. Kex-9 entered the cell, his compound eyes scanning the sterile environment with what might have been disapproval. The engineer said formally, "I have been granted permission to speak with you regarding your current situation." Stood grateful for any contact with someone who had shown him kindness. Kex-9, I didn't expect to see you here. Your actions have created significant disruption to the mining operations, Kex-9 continued, but his tone was less accusatory than had expected. Production quotas have been missed, research schedules have been delayed, and there is considerable debate among the station leadership about how to proceed. I never intended to disrupt anything, said. I was trying to prevent harm to a living being. Kex-9 studied him for a long moment. Your belief in the consciousness of the crystalline network is sincere. This much is clear from your responses during interrogation. But sincerity alone is not sufficient to alter consortium policy or mining operations. Then you believe me? Asked, hope flickering in his chest. I believe that your interpretation of the data is possible, Kex-9 replied carefully. However, possibility is not the same as proof. The consortium requires concrete evidence before making decisions that would affect economic interests and established procedures. Felt a flash of frustration. How much evidence do you need? The network shows adaptive behavior, complex communication patterns, and responses to external stimuli. What more would it take to convince the authorities that it's sentient? Direct, unambiguous communication, Kex-9 said. Something that could not be explained by natural phenomena or programmed responses. The quantum field patterns you recorded are remarkable, but they can be interpreted as complex automatic reactions rather than conscious thought. But I felt its consciousness, protested. The loneliness, the pain, the hope when it realized I was trying to communicate, those aren't automatic reactions, they're emotions. Kex Nine's compound eyes focused on with an intensity that reminded him of their first conversation in the mining tunnels. You speak of feeling the intelligence's emotions. This suggests a level of empathic connection that is unusual even among species known for telepathic abilities. How do you explain this phenomenon? Paused, realizing that he was about to reveal something he hadn't fully understood himself. I don't know how to explain it. When I established the communication link, it wasn't just data transfer. It was like touching another mind directly. I could feel its thoughts and emotions as if they were my own. Humans are not known to possess telepathic capabilities, Kex Nine observed. Maybe we've never had the right circumstances to develop them, suggested. Or maybe the quantum fields generated by the crystalline intelligence created a unique opportunity for direct neural interface. Kex Nine made a sound that had learned to recognize as deep thought. If what you describe is accurate, it would represent a significant expansion of known human capabilities. Such a development would be of considerable interest to consortium researchers. The way Kex Nine said it made uncomfortable. I'm not interested in becoming a research subject. I just want to protect the crystalline intelligence from further harm. That may not be a choice available to you, Kex Nine said gently. Your unauthorized communication has already attracted attention from high-level consortium officials. They are considering transferring you to a specialized research facility for extensive testing. Felt his blood run cold. He had heard stories about humans who had been taken for testing by consortium scientists. Most never returned, and those who did were often so psychologically damaged that they couldn't function normally. There might be another option, Kex Nine continued, lowering his voice. If you could demonstrate your communication abilities under controlled conditions, proving the consciousness of the crystalline intelligence, it might be possible to argue for protective protocols rather than continued mining. You're asking me to risk everything on the chance that the authorities will recognize the intelligence's rights, said. I am suggesting that this may be the only opportunity to save both the crystalline intelligence and yourself, Kex Nine replied. The alternative is likely to be transferred to a research facility where your unique abilities will be studied indefinitely. Consider the options, none of which seemed particularly appealing. But the thought of the crystalline intelligence suffering alone while he was subjected to endless testing made the decision clear. What would I need to do? Doctor has proposed a controlled communication experiment, Kex Nine explained. You would be given access to enhanced quantum communication equipment under strict supervision. If you can establish meaningful contact with the intelligence and provide proof of its consciousness, the research team will recommend that the matter be referred to the Consortium Ethics Council. And if I can't prove it, then you will be classified as delusional and transferred to a medical facility for treatment, Kex Nine said bluntly. The crystalline intelligence will be reclassified as a valuable but non-sentient resource, and mining operations will continue on an accelerated schedule. The stakes couldn't have been higher. His entire future and the life of the crystalline intelligence would depend on his ability to prove something that the alien authorities were already predisposed to disbelieve. But it was better than the alternatives, and it might be the intelligence's only chance for survival. I'll do it, said. 3 days later, found himself back in the research division, but under very different circumstances. Instead of the respect and collaboration he had briefly enjoyed, he was now surrounded by security officers and monitored constantly by sophisticated scanning equipment. The communication chamber they had constructed for the experiment was filled with quantum field generators, neural monitoring devices, and recording systems designed to capture every aspect of the interaction. Doctor stood before a massive control panel, her luminous eyes reflecting the glow of dozens of status indicators. This equipment will allow us to monitor the quantum communication in real time while simultaneously recording your neural responses. Any attempt to falsify data or manipulate the results will be immediately detected. Chief Engineer Vex 5 and the legal officer who had questioned were also present, along with several other high-ranking consortium officials whose species didn't recognize. The weight of their attention was almost overwhelming, but he forced himself to focus on the task ahead. The communication window will last exactly 30 minutes, Doctor continued. During that time, you must establish contact with the alleged crystalline intelligence and obtain proof of its consciousness that will satisfy the reviewing authorities. Failure to provide satisfactory evidence will result in immediate termination of the experiment. Took his place at the communication console, his hands shaking slightly as he activated the quantum field generators. D for what was right could change everything. The tears on his cheeks had dried, but the determination in his heart burned brighter than ever. The real test was just beginning. The stars outside his window seemed brighter somehow, full of possibilities he had never dared to imagine. The first time since arriving at the station, he felt like maybe he was exactly where he needed to be.